You found your way to Blood Moon Radio. I'm Coraley, and this is where we follow the threads the world wants us to drop. Today's episode is part 1 in a special 2-part series where I sit down with Mirey, a registered clinical counselor, and Avery, a university instructor, to discuss the trope of the too much woman. Together, we explore what it means to be called too much by society, in the workplace, and in interpersonal relationships. Welcome to another episode of Blood Moon Radio. Today I am chatting with Avery Hulbert, who is a university instructor at College of the Rockies, and Mirey Faema, who is a registered clinical counselor, and we are going to be talking about the concept of the too much woman. Let's start with when each of you hear the phrase too much woman, what comes to mind?
Yeah, when I hear the too much woman, I don't usually take it as a compliment. I know that. I've been called extra, and I can take that as a compliment sometimes, because if it's coming from other women and it's about like something I'm wearing, then I'm like, sure, that makes sense. That's more, I know you're trying to compliment me, but in general, yeah, when I hear too much, I do not feel pleased. I don't take it as a compliment. I take it as you have to do something different to make me feel more comfortable.
Yeah.
Instead of me owning the fact that maybe you're either not the right fit for me or that I can't state a need or a boundary. I'm going to put that on you.
Yeah. It is, I do a lot with the podcast where I take things that have been said to me or that I know have been said to other women or that are just kind of common and twist them around into, well, I'm going to make this something positive where it's not. Like I use the hashtag too much woman a lot. Claiming words is a big thing. So reclaiming the language around it. But absolutely, when I've been called too much, in past relationships, it's definitely been meant to make me feel like I need to be smaller to make them comfortable or like there's something wrong with me.
Oh, this one's deep. I get this a lot. I get it a lot professionally. I get it a lot in interpersonal relationships, even relationships we choose, sometimes with other women. And to me, it's a huge trigger. It's a hot point. It's like, it goes like you're sort of being suspected of being hyper-feminist, hyper-feminism. You're taking up too much space. To me, it's a segue to them wanting to use the word bitch, which then is, I'm being too outspoken. For me, it's kind of a cue to get in line, that I've crossed that cultural definition of being a good, well-behaved woman. And it's like a firing shot of somebody who's trying to use softer language, but also in a very passive-aggressive, sort of manipulative way. Like, they're not just outright saying, be quiet or this or that. They don't necessarily, but they know what they're doing when this is said. And it's usually as an attack, a warning. And also this one, I get it a lot when I'm over emotional. And sort of being essentially penalized in that relationship or being requested to step back in silence because I'm being way too emotionally invested or like fiery. Like it usually comes when there's like an emotional rise. Usually it comes when there's like advocacy, when you're standing up for something that, it's really, really, really important. So
let's talk about that idea of like how to be a woman, right? Where you said, there's this expectation of us to be down here, you're not allowed to be assertive or good at what you do. But in modern times, women are expected to hold a job, take care of the home, do all the traditional female roles and somehow fit into work roles, but dimmed down. How are modern women supposed to hit all those boxes when they're so far apart? Like, for example, when I worked in construction, I can't be passive. No one would listen to me. especially because I'm female. But then I get the reputation of being a bitch.
I think that's the expectation in this era. I think we're supposed to, kind of exercise that equality, right? Like we are equal to men is what we're told. Um, and it's equitable, but it's not. The way when we do step up and sort of challenge that, it usually doesn't end well. Usually the woman in the relationship is the one who then is walking away, like you said, as like a bitch or wow, what was her problem? But we're expected to do anything and everything. And as I'm raising children in this world, it's super evident, like everything falls on the mom. I'm going to give you a perfect example. I have a career. I'm an academic, and I'm always expected to, my husband has always been able to work his career and do what he wanted in that way, like very supportive, like not that, but there's never any conversation about where's dad. Where it's always like, well, where's mom? When I travel a lot for work, it's like, well, who's taking care of the children? And I'm like, they're bad, right? Like we have a very equal relationship, but it's just really interesting that when things go wrong, who does the school call? Who does, right? Like all of these things are falling on the mothers, but then we're not to talk about this busyness, this craziness, our lack of like, we need to dial it down. It still goes down to that you're to be seen, but not heard. And I feel that so much in this era that we're in right now. Like our grandmothers, my grandmother was still in that era of like, she broke into the work fields. So I was raised by very, very strong, dominant women. And she was not a stay-at-home mom in the 50s, which was like not cool. And right. So I've been raised with this. And it's so interesting to even see within our family how hard it is that everyone expects when the kids are sick, I'm the one who has to take time off from my career. Like I'm the mom. So there's this expectation that we need to be here and financially we have to be engaged in the workplace. But there's this expectation that we do literally need to do it all. And we need to behave and follow the rules and still show up all like, right? Like when you look at how men can show up in the world versus women, it's so interesting to see how like everyone notices a mom showing up at the hockey game disheveled and looking like she has like truth, like she hasn't slept in a week. But nobody notices that dad looks like he just rolled out from the booze can all night.
One of the best compliments I've ever gotten was when my great aunt told me that I remind her a lot of my Gigi, and she was kind of a powerhouse. She was this tiny little woman who, her first husband, who she got divorced from because he didn't want to have their baby, she left him. So this is in the 1920s, 1930s, right? And then she married my great grandpa, and they had 4 children, and he died, unfortunately, in a car accident about a week after I think their youngest was born. And he was the love of her life. She never got remarried. And so she was this single woman in a house with 4 children, raising them, working in a time where that was unheard of. It was already unheard of that she would leave her husband instead of just doing what he wanted. And yeah, so when you talked about your grandma and coming from this line of women, I resonated.
I feel like I have the opposite, where I come from the line of women who were more like, the housewife, the stay-at-home mom. And I do notice it's like that the misogyny that exists within women as well, where we forget sometimes, like, because it's just so ingrained in society. And I noticed, like, when I worked in male-dominated fields, like before becoming a counselor, I was in tech and marketing, and I developed like this very like loud, even like bullish persona to be able to fit into the room. And I noticed my emotions had to happen in private. Like the only emotion that was okay was anger, but I knew it was often the most like bullying or prejudice I ever felt in those type of industries was actually from other women, because it was kind of before the time where I felt like we started to band together. There was so much competition, and I would hear people like with those kind of assumptions, like, oh, because I was younger or because I I must have flirted with the boss. There was still so much of that happening because I have a bubbly personality. Um, yeah, and so it would always come from other women. And then I do notice, like in my family, it's like I don't have children and I am very career orientated because I don't believe we should be doing it all. It's impossible to do it all. So I was like, because of how focused I'm on career, I was like, there just wasn't enough time to focus on relationships and those elements. Because yeah, the expectation that you're supposed to be successful at everything is so unrealistic. But I do notice like the lack of relatability that I have because of that. So it's like even talking to, sometimes my mom, it's like it's like, oh, who's your friend? Is your friend still with that person? Or like, I don't have anything. The achievements don't seem to really resonate or get follow-up questions. Or sometimes I get the question of, oh, you should probably check with a professional about that. And always used to have to be like, I am the professional. People hire me to ask these questions. People hire me to consult on their business. I am the professional that the CEO hires. And I was like, so if I have this idea, I am the person I would call to implement it. And it used to drive me crazy. I was like, it's like, no matter how much I achieve, it will never be recognized in the same way.
Witnessed, I see you. You're
Yeah.
amazing.
Yes, it's so true. Like it is so true. I hear you. I feel you in so many ways. I want to build off just what you said there about the women competing. And this is in my field, we talk a lot about like that concept of lateral violence. And we know statistically that you're more likely to be hurt by people, and violence happens more likely in interpersonal relationships where in all, whether it's physical, mental, financial, all types, we're most likely to be hurt by people who are closest to you. And it's really interesting because that's what I heard you kind of saying, right? It's the people who are in our circle. It's people who should have our back. And you would think like other women, but where we have, and myself, where it formed those alliances is like with men who respect you, who see you and the work, but that competition, that lateral violence, that metaphor of crab in the bucket of like other women tearing down women more than picking each other up.
Mm.
And I think that's where that like, there might be this equality that like we're striving for with like men in the world, which isn't there, but also how hard it is to get ahead as a woman when you're constantly sort of being torn down by other women. And I think that's where I find the hardest is like, it's women who ask me who's taking care of your children. It's women who ask me, I don't know how you do it all. It's the women who are the ones who are like, oh, well, maybe we should just call so-and-so, right? Like when you were talking about when people are like, maybe you should ask a professional. And it's like, dude, I am. It's really interesting that everybody knows sort of what everyone's dads do, right? Or it's like, oh, okay, so, dad does this and that's that. But like, what does your mom do? And then it's like, you even look at women who stay at home and raise their children. And it's like, then people say that's it.
Yeah. You can't win.
And so it's this, you can't win. You really can't. And the number one issue is coming from like other women. So it's like this, and I've been trying to figure this out. Is it like jealousy? Is it like based in, that competition of survival? Like I can't wrap my head around what it is, but it's so terrible. And where it's like the people who are calling us too much women, sometimes are other women.
I think it's that like internalized misogyny, like to talk about, we live in a patriarchal society. You can pretend that we don't need feminism anymore. I get in arguments with my family all the time because they're very redneck and they hate that I call myself a feminist, but I'm like, it is necessary. Listen to what I'm saying about my experience. Like something that resonated with me when you were talking, Avery, was when the construction company with my husband, I built the business, I organized the business, I created the systems. He goes and he builds the things and I do all the other stuff. But it was constantly referred to as his business. And people would email me and they would be like asking to talk to him, or they would ignore him. Even if I had corrected them in an email and said, it's actually Coraley, they'd still write to him just a complete wiping out of everything I do. People in my family even would be like, how is his business going? It's my business too. I'm a 50% shareholder. Like, it was just this constant ignorance of having a business is not just doing what you see out in public. A business is a complex organism, and there are decisions to be made on the back end. And if you're not managing your money properly, or scheduling your jobs properly, doing your project management, it doesn't run properly. You can't survive. But it was because it was me doing it, completely ignored.
Well, and I think that's so common. So I see it a lot. Like, I work at the Fernie Women's Resource Center, and we see it a lot it's often, I think, how we value ourselves. And because I think a lot of that competition with women really is because we're constantly being bombarded with messaging. And I think it comes from a place of not feeling good enough, but never really feeling like you can get there, because it's millions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars is spent making people feel inadequate. So you buy products. That is the entire marketing industry. And when we think of feminism, when I'm like, it helps men too. The patriarchy is not creating healthy relationships for men. It's not allowing them to have a spectrum of how they show up in a gender role. It's not, it's kind of creating all of these binaries that we have to fit into, and dynamics that are unhealthy. And when I see that, it really is like the unpaid labor of just really not being seen. Like, the narrative of the woman trying to take all of my money and do all of this, where it's like, and I even can think of all the unlearning I had to do, or all the biases I had, where I would have male friends and I wouldn't challenge that narrative that they had of, just coming after me for everything. I feel kind of sorry for them. And in a way, it's like I still do feel sad, because I feel like men aren't getting it, because like they don't understand what they're doing wrong. They don't understand where the disconnect is. They are not understanding how, like, to adapt to show up in a world where women don't need them for money and security and to be able to get a mortgage and a credit card. Like, so they don't know, like, and then they've been put into a box where they're not allowed to have emotions. And so they don't know how to emotionally connect, which is now what they need to be able to do. And it's like the narrative, they haven't been raised in a lot of times. Like, I'm in my 40s, and I feel like there's that in between demographic where they weren't raised to contribute in the same way that now we are. More people are raising their kids to do. So it's like they're just not understanding where things are falling short. So it's like this whole patriarchal system, this whole like trying to fit people into gender stereotypes is not working for anybody.
No.
It's like creating a massive disconnect between humans instead of connection, and then creating these situations where, yeah, people are seen as a villain because their job at home, it's like they sacrifice their career for you and your children. And that was part of their contribution to the family system. And so just because you had the job that gave you money for it doesn't mean that what they did wasn't worth 50% of that value.
I wonder if that's why the phrase too much woman has so much power, because I would consider myself a strong, independent person. But when that was said to me, I did feel shame and worry that there was something wrong with me. Maybe I am too much. Maybe my expectations are too high. Maybe I shouldn't be this loud.
I think that I just wanted to kind of go back a bit to what Mirey said about the emotional regulation and lacking in, or not lacking, but you really had me thinking about whose responsibility it is in society, in our patriarchal society, to teach men emotional regulation. And that's the mother and the female, right? And the females uphold that. And the females are the ones that are responsible. But the part where I was thinking too, that I started kind of making these connections is that when we're in these relationships with these boys who then become men, and in our society is that when women become too much is almost when we're asking them to hold themselves responsible and accountable for their roles that they're playing in these larger patriarchal controlling, these capitalist economies where it's like, look, none of you would be here without us. right? Let's just be really, really clear here. But it's really interesting that everything's like, we talk about these gender roles, nobody wants to own those. But when we get into these relationships and it's like we're pushing, we're holding accountable, we're asking for responsibility and accountable, like you can't treat me like this. Or it's like that's where we start getting conflict, is on the micro level where we say to the individual, these systems aren't working. You can't treat like this. So that difference between where's the culture, these gender roles that I guess we can now call traditional gender roles, when those are showing up in our interpersonal relationships and we're seeing that conflict, that's where we're seeing even more hurt being done, is when women are like, I'm here and I'm asking you to treat me, see me, feel me as an actual equal, even though they say we're equal. That's where we start getting that too much women. You're too emotional. Nobody wants to accept that micro level individual responsibility and accountability and seeing like they can detach themselves from these larger systems, but they're replicating it in these everyday. So when we say time out, stop, this is the response we get is that we need to change in that interaction, or we're too much, or we're being a bitch, or who are we to say this, and or a raging feminist.
Yeah, and I see that a lot. Like when I was thinking about this topic, I really felt like a lot of it is rooted in gender, like creating a binary gender system. And I'm hopeful, like I feel like it's like any change, everybody's going to fight against it because it's confusing and they don't understand. And it's always interesting to have that conversation of we're not trying to take power away from you. It's like we're trying to level everybody else up so it's more of an even field. And I think that's always a tough thing because even when we think of feminism, a lot of the time, even for BIPOC women, it's still not creating equality from that perspective either. And then there's still a lot of microaggressions, even in those systems that are trying to create change. But I even think of seeing it at work where it was like, I would say things that needed to be said. The men that were in the higher up positions would commend me, like they wouldn't have the confidence, I guess, or they wouldn't want to be the bad guy, so they wouldn't want to say it. So I would say it because it's not getting pointed out and I'm getting frustrated. But then I'm critiqued of I would see where no one would listen to me. I would have a male repeat what I said and then everyone would agree. And then the feedback I would always get, which would stick with me, which I'm like, are all these kind of microaggressions of, well, it's just like the ideas come out of the sky and then through your mouth. Like you don't stop to pause and think about them. Or I got told you use too many words when you're saying it. Or there was always something that I wasn't doing like a man would do, when it's like there's different forms of leadership, there's different forms of expression. And it's like, instead of you're saying what needs to be said and we won't, it was always there's this criticism of my approach when I'm like, if you're not saying it, like you're in the leadership role, you should be the one saying it, not me. And why is it always critiqued the way that I deliver it?
Ray, I'm really happy to hear you brought up the concept of microaggressions. This is something that's sort of newish in our rhetoric around how to create safe employment. We use it, we hear it a lot in employer language. Instead of using, bullying or calling people out, we call them microaggressions, which essentially means, if we break down the word micro, it means small. But I actually am going to use the H word. I hate this word because I think what it has done is it's given us permissions to look at these as minute. But then I also look at it in a sense that it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yes.
And so I worry about this language, and I see it culturally and very capitalist, like working in post-secondary environment, as being a lot of the microaggressions are looking at, like we talked about, those who are targeted by intersectionality, right? Our BIPOC women, people who are outside the cisgender, that are outside these like white people, sort of the weird, as we call it, the Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic group of people, they're being targeted more. And so how insulting is it to call these micro when they are huge? And it's like, now we're seeing a racial slur or calling someone a bitch. That's a microaggression. I'm like, no, it's not. So now we're arguing about what we're calling it versus looking at it as this is wrong. And how it must be nice that somebody in some organizational structure who now has coined this word microaggression, that these are not microaggressions. And when they come to us, they do not feel little. And so for me, this whole concept of this like microaggression, and in a very, sort of male dominated post-secondary system where we do see a lot of women in leadership, but it has to be like this non-emotional landscape. And we're calling these things microaggressions, and everything has to be measured. Mm-hmm. It's not like you can't talk about your feelings being hurt. It's like, it has to be. And I feel like this language around the microaggressions is just completely downplaying and offering this distraction that we're not calling these out, because there is this idea that there is this equality. Look, we have women up in leadership. We have more women, in post-secondary participating in studies. So we got to be equal. Meanwhile, our recent statistics in Canada are showing that women's in post-secondary are being subject to like sexual violence at super high rates. So then I'm like, why? And as someone who works in this system, you can see exactly why. And it's just really interesting that we look at this, we look at equality and we're like, okay, if this is equality, then why are women getting hurt more than men? And why is it specifically their sex and their gender that's being targeted in violence? So this idea of these are just these little, like sort of these little microaggressions. And I'm like, whoa, this is like changing our whole culture. And we're actually seeing measurable differences. We're seeing a rise in violence against women in post-secondary across this nation, where our governments have now come and said it is required in post-secondary institutions that you have a sexual violence policy. And I'm like, okay, this is really interesting, because if we're all equal, why are we having to do this?
I wonder if the term microaggression wasn't originally intended to draw attention to the fact that, privilege can make something seem small to you, or you may not notice it as much. And then the opposite side of that coin is that we tend to associate, like you said, micro means small, as something insignificant versus, originally maybe it was intended to be like, you may not notice this as much because there's so many things when you're privileged that you have to actively think about. Yeah. Something may come out of my mouth at one point where I'm like, oh, wait a second, that may not have landed that well because of this person's experience or their background that I didn't think about at the time.
Yeah, and I feel like that's where, like, when I think of the examples that I gave, to me, that's where my kind of understanding of the term microaggression for that situation was, because it's feedback. Right? That it's like feedback over the years, which I took in as like, people in positions of leadership trying to help me grow. And then now looking back from that perspective of really starting to recognize like how women are subtly treated in the workplace, or how it shows up. That's where I'm like, that's those kind of little microaggressions that just start to implant that I'm being too much, that I'm saying it in the wrong way, that I need to tone down how I deliver. Whereas before, I would have, like, when it happened, I just saw it as constructive criticism. And then, when I start thinking of it in the context of this topic, I'm like, okay, those little comments. But I definitely agree that the term microaggression, when we're talking about racism, like sexual assault, sexism, not an appropriate term whatsoever. Like, calling someone a bitch is calling someone a bitch. Assaulting someone or being racist is assaulting someone or being racist.
And definitely, and wanting to clarify about, I loved what you just said about the idea of in the moment, you didn't feel like, and that's what I think the point I'm trying like to see is a microaggression is something that I should be able to call and recognize. Like, I think your example is perfect. In the moment, you don't really see it, but then when you see it all together, you're like, wait a second, But for someone else in an institutional structure or in the world to be like, that's just a microaggression, or asking you about microaggressions, and you're like, I'm like, wait, I think we've totally lost sight of like, an aggression is aggression. Like, it's an intentional act to hurt somebody. And like, yeah, there's accidents. So, but I'm like, it's just interesting the words that we choose to use. And I think that what it comes down to is exactly what you said about the intention. I think that microaggressions happen when it's not intentional. And both of you kind of said that, where it's like, oh my gosh, afterwards, if I said that to that person, that could have been interpreted this way. Our privilege can hurt other people in ways that we're just not aware of. But I'm finding it being used in different ways.
I think that's common though, right? Anytime change or advocacy is happening, I've noticed the terms that we apply to it get twisted around or are used to then try to bring it back or undermine. I had a debate with someone asked me if the podcast was feminist, and I said, well, I think so, and they were like, oh, do you consider yourself a feminist? And I was like, you don't consider yourself a feminist? Like, are you telling me you're sexist? Because I feel like feminism is positive for everyone. And if you're not feminist, you're basically saying you believe women should be less than, and we don't need this advocacy. And they agreed with me, but they continued to argue with me because they had seen some YouTube videos where these women were very anti-men and they were this extreme. And I was like, well, there's going to be extremes. And humans we're extreme. We're such a vast array. It's wonderful, but it's difficult, right? But you can't just be like, discount the need for feminism, discount the need for advocacy, discount the need for talking about equality or treating people well and trying to get to those things because some people are going the opposite direction. So you're saying that we should just keep women oppressed because this group over here may try to oppress men.
I see this a lot. I have such a great privilege to be able to work with learners and every year, and hundreds of different people who are reshaping and learning things that they've never learned before. And one of the big things that we talk about is feminism. And it's really interesting to see how generally people don't have an understanding of feminism. So when you ask them what feminism is, they're like, bra burning, witches. And you're like, oh, okay, tell me more. And then we present it like it's a spectrum, just like everything else. It's a spectrum, just like your political orientation stuff. And they're like, oh, and just like how you said, Coraley, about people are like, okay, so you don't stand for this. And it's like everything, like Christianity, like political spectrum, there is a continuum of, and people find where they are. And so absolutely, there's extraordinary like right-wing feminism. And so it's really interesting to see. And I think this is one of the most exciting things that I get the privilege of seeing almost every day is people changing their mindset and learning different ways of being in the world breaks them apart from these cultural norms that continue on of that, well, this is how my parents think, or this is what I see on media, versus now they're like, oh, okay, see, so when I ask them, like, I can even ask them in a quiz, like, what does it mean to identify as a feminist? Do you identify as a feminist? Not that I would give them points for agreeing a certain way. And so I actually see education as being one of these really powerful tools in this critical thinking. Like, not everybody's going to change, but that's not what we're going. We're going for people to open their minds to see that there's many different ways of seeing the world. But the people who are doing this over here, you still need to respect them. You still need to see that this is important. So instead of being at a party and being like, oh, you're a feminist, it's being like, oh, okay, you're a feminist. You're doing some great, right? Like it's just really interesting.
And I think it's the whole, humans are traditionally meaning-making creatures, right? So it's like, we're always trying to look for meaning. We're always trying to understand the world. And I feel like labels has become a big part of that, which can be really problematic in all areas because it leads to a lot of judgment of either yourself or others. It also leads to a lot of misunderstanding because I think of the word like white privilege is an argument I have with a lot of people where it's like helping them understand what that means in friend groups. And a lot of where I start with is the fact that your understanding of the word privilege in your experience is, I grew up and went to the private schools. I had money. Our parents were able to afford the name brand clothes. And I was like, for a lot of people, that does not resonate with their understanding of what privilege means. So when they're like, was poor though, and I didn't have these, it's really hard to like help them see past their comprehension and their meaning of the word privilege to really understand what the term white privilege means. And so I think sometimes it's like terminology that gets coined, like you were saying with microaggressions. If we have a pre-existing notion of what different terms mean, it really starts to hinder people's ability to comprehend these new concepts or really understand what the person is trying to articulate or teach you. And even thinking of like that identity politics that is pushed on people, like I've had times where it's like, I just have my thoughts, I stand where I stand. And then I've had people being like, you're super liberal or you're this or you're that. And I'm like, that's just not how I would identify. Because I am like, and I'm like, I care about human rights. That shouldn't make me super liberal. Like,
Yeah. And
so,
and building on that, isn't it kind of like if I like kind of bring us back to this too much woman, sometimes it is a compliment to me. I'll never forget this. My husband had once said to me about how when we go to certain gatherings, how people change when I'm in the room. And he was trying to give me a heads up that I make people uncomfortable. And it wasn't anything like that. He was just like, yeah, when you are there, people change. And I'm like, I don't see what the problem is. I'm like, so they're better humans when I'm there because they know I'm going to hold them accountable for their words and their actions. And he's like, yeah, I guess. Right. So I'm like, that makes me feel good. That was probably one of the biggest compliment, kind of what he was trying to say was that like, you make people uncomfortable. Like, you're too much. Right. I get that a lot. But meanwhile, I'm like, but like that doesn't insult me because that means that how I live my life is true to what's important to me. So I can't just like turn off my radar of like my moral compass doesn't turn off when I go around certain people. Like I will pick my words or I'll pick my like, we hear this pick your battle, which is really interesting. But I'm like, I find that was like a huge compliment being told that you're too much. Sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, especially like as Coraley said, when we're around like this group of like rednecks where it's like, okay, to stoop to these like caveman levels of like atrocities and horrendousness. And then you have people standing up and being like, dude, this is not okay. And so, and I think this goes to our concept of too much women. If we've been raised around these strong, fiery women that have told us to stand up, it's like being told that's like, you're too much woman. It's like, you're kind of like, wait a second, this is who I am. How am I too much? Right. So it kind of then creates this identity that comes from, like you talked about how within yourself, you have this view. And then you talked about like the media, everything telling us all of a sudden, it's like, we're not feminist enough, but then the narrative discourse saying, okay, you need to diet down a bit, like, but more makeup, more anti-aging,
yeah.
but less talking and less like standing up for others. They take up less space, but it's not that they want us to take up less space. It's they want us to take up space in a very specific way. And it again, to me, feeds into this idea that patriarchy and sort of capitalism has this one idea of what a woman is and what feminism is. And the theoretical discourse of feminism has nothing to do with that feminist icon that exists within our capitalist patriarchy society. And so I think as women, we're constantly like, how were we raised? How does this look? How does this behave? I love the women who literally don't give a fuck. Like I want to be those women, the ones that are like, I'm going to do what I want. I'm going to look how I want. I'm going to act how I want. And I always say, I'm like, I wish I could be like that. I wish I could show up in the world, having that work done within myself, that I don't really care what other people have to say. Is that you can call me too much woman. You can call me bitch. You can call me whatever you want, but that's your problem, not mine. Wow, I got on a tangent.
I think what you were talking about kind of like touches so much on the idea of perspective, right? When you told the story about Dwight saying people get uncomfortable, you could have taken that in the in the realm of what society sort of would expect you to do, which is to shrink and be like, oh, I'm making everyone uncomfortable, but you didn't. What you did is you said, well, yeah, I hold people accountable. That's a good thing. And your perspective is what shifted, whether that was a negative or a positive.
And then like, in a relationship, we do need to figure these out. And I think that that's where a lot of this is like, you know, we've been together for 20 years. So he's kind of figuring out is like, don't tell me to take up less space because that ain't going to work well for you.
Hasn't worked this far.
Right? But then it's like in all these relationships, we figure out, and then it's like, but then we do need to show up in these grand ways so often. Like in society, absent women are really noted. Absent mothers, like it is really noted when there is a lack of women or female presence in a situation.
Yeah.
But then we have to follow these codes.
Yeah.
Well, and I find like thinking of like when I look at like even studying psychology, it's still very centric and like a lot of the learning is all of the traditional where psychology started. There's so much time spent on early psychological theory, which again was mostly white men with the hysterical woman trope. So it's like we don't really like I remember not really touching like all of the feminist theory I learned was through my own learning or through my own directive. And when we look at it, there is a sense of, oh, feminist theory, yes, that's for women, but the whole idea of it is really just client-centered, giving people choice, allowing them to decide what works best for them, and helping them recognize all of the social, cultural, biological experiences that impact their mental health, which I use so much feminist theory. I work with all genders, and even with men, a lot of it is helping them understand, like, yes, I can understand why you feel like you're not being appreciated for contributing in the home because this is how you're raised. Or I can understand why it feels really hard to show different emotions because this is common within society, or why it's hard to connect, or why it's hard to talk to your friends about these things, and helping them deconstruct what the patriarchy has done to their mental health as well. It is something that it's not just for women. It like can really help everybody understand. And again, it's like, I think it always comes back to these like gendered ideas of trying to fit people into a box of how they're supposed to be, how they're supposed to behave, how they're supposed to show up in the world. And all that's doing is making people be less and less authentic and be more and more like repressed with their own emotional experience and have less connection to their bodies and how they want to be. And it's super frustrating to see. But yeah, even thinking of when you first mentioned, like the when I was thinking about the first time I ever heard being too much, remember it was with a friend, and we'd been drinking, and I was definitely talking about like things not working out in relationships. And this was a person I'd had like a long-term friendship with, also dabbled in a bit of a relationship, and some of it's very important to me. And their comment was, "You're just too much." And I quipped back almost immediately because I got sick of hearing this with, maybe you just weren't enough. And then I noticed their moment of, well, yeah, they thought about it and took it on. And it was kind of reflecting on it. I was like, what I said was mean. I felt like a viper kind of quipped back in defense. My comment wasn't helpful at all. But what it helped me kind of realize is a lot of the discourse of why women are being seen as too much is there is also a big feeling not good enough that is happening, especially in heterosexual relationships with a lot of men. That's a really common. It's like, nothing I do is ever good enough. I don't know how to connect properly. I don't know how to manage work, and then coming home and doing things. I don't know how to show up. I'm always in trouble. And so it's almost like this narrative that's been created, you're being too much, instead of really addressing that core issue of, why are you feeling like you're not enough? Why are you feeling like that person needs to be less so that you can feel okay?
As always, thank you for listening. This has been part 1 in our special 2-part episode with Mirey Faema and Avery Hulbert. Be sure to tune in next time to catch the rest of the conversation. If you'd like to give us a little extra love, head over to our website, www.bloodmoonradio.com, where you'll find merchandise, digital products, and our membership areas, including our newest membership option, the Velvet Parlor, where weekly meditations are delivered straight to your inbox. And until next time, remember, the truth echoes louder after dark, whispered, unfiltered, waiting to be touched. See you soon.